Hello, Edgar.
Hello, how are you doing? It's like we're in the same room.
I know, you're all the way over in London, and I have to stop myself from yelling like I often do on Zoom, like, hello, can you hear me? But how's London going?
I've had the strange experience of being like a sort of in one of my like dystopian movies in the sense of I wandered around a deserted London. So I feel like it's some kind of, I don't know, poetic justice for having written Shaun of the Dead that I then get to be Shaun wandering around completely deserted center. It's very, very strange.
Yeah, and you've been talking a lot about the cinematic experience during this time, and so I want to take you back to your very first movie memory, which I think was Star Wars, wasn't it? Was that the first movie you remember seeing?
My parents took me and my brother when I must have been 3, and I'd certainly seen films on TV at that point, but I'd never seen one on the big screen. And I saw it at this cinema in Bournemouth called the Galaxy, which is now a Methodist church, I think. And they had like a star field on the ceiling. And so at the start of that movie, when, the kind of the rebel ship and then the Star Destroyer came over, it seemed like they were coming out of the ceiling. So I was very unsure where like the ceiling ended and Star Wars started.
Yeah, and when you're 3, I mean, my first movie memory was when I was 3 as well, and I saw The Never-Ending Story, and then I had to be dragged out of the theater because I started crying when the horse died so loudly. That was an embarrassment to my mum. But you don't have that awareness of what a movie is, and like you said, where the screen ends and begins. And so what was the point for you where you started to watch movies more obsessively, or when movies started to become a thing in your life?
I think the obsession started quite early in terms of after that, then my parents would take me and my brother to a lot of films, and they were art teachers, but then they sort of, tried to strike out on their own as artists, and they would do these craft fairs. And this isn't something that parents should do now, or maybe even then. But in lieu of a babysitter, my dad, when they were doing craft fairs, would dump me and my brother at the cinema, aged like 6 and 8, to like watch a double bill. I don't think I would do that with my kids, like leave them in a cinema on their own. But that's what we used to happen. And listen, in that, nothing bad happened, but we used to absolutely love it. It was just left on our own in the cinema. But what he would do is he would mistime it. So if it was a double bill, usually you'd watch the movie that you didn't want to watch first, and you really wanted to see the one afterwards. So if it was, say, like a double bill of The Cat from Outer Space and The Incredible Hulk, and the one you really wanted to see was The Incredible Hulk, and then it's like you saw the whole of The Cat from Outer Space, and then like a third of the way through The Incredible Hulk. Before the Hulk had even turned into the Hulk, my dad has come back into the cinema and says, "Oh, we gotta go." And then I'm like pulled out of the cinema, like yelling and crying, like, "No, I want to see the Hulk." So there was a lot of that, of my dad taking us to double bills, but then not really leaving enough time to see both movies. I also remember going to see The Black Hole in 1979 when I must have been 5. And at the end of that movie, the last shot of that movie is like a new planet. They go through the black hole, and then the baddies go to hell, and the goodies seem to go to heaven, and there's this kind of like planet it's like the last shot of the movie. And then on the way out in the lobby, there's the poster for Alien, and the Alien poster is the big egg. But I, as a 5-year-old, thinking like, hey, is that the follow-up to Black Hole? Can we see that? It's like, no, you can't see Alien. Why can't we see Alien? The point when I realized that people made films, that films were not just existed on the screen, and maybe people were in them and made them, was, I think, when I saw Raiders of the Lost Ark. And mainly because Han Solo was in a different movie. So it's like, this is an actor playing a character. Yeah. And, a lot of the promotion of that movie was, from the producer of Star Wars and from the director of Close Encounters, 2 other films that I had seen. So now there was, for the first time, like a bit of cross-reference in the marketing. So I started to understand these films are made by people. And then a big magazine for me when I was that age was Starburst, which was sort of like a bit like a cross between Starlog and Fangoria. And certainly in the early 80s, it had a lot of horror content. And so then there's a strange thing that happens where these are movies that I cannot see, and my parents will
Yeah.
not take me to, and we don't have a VCR, and I can't like watch them anyway. But I get to know a lot about movies that I will not be seeing for like 10 years.
Yeah. And also, would you say that kickstarted your imagination?
Yes.
Maybe when it comes to creating films, that you would create not only the double bills that you didn't get to see in your mind of what happened, but also these movies that you weren't allowed to see.
Absolutely. I'd say even further to that, that there's something about seeing just the poster art and imagining what the film might be like. So, and it's so weird because I think about it with like this Starburst magazine. You'd flip to the back and then they'd have little tiny like pictures of posters. So you'd see like the quad poster for Night of the Living Dead, like a grainy black and white reproduction of it. And then you can only imagine what that film might be like from the poster. So it's sort of amazing to me in this sort of like having grown up in a pre-internet age where not everything is at your fingertips, of like how much you would project onto these movies that you might have seen one black and white still or like the poster.
So you're obviously very inspired by genre films when you were growing up. Was there a point when it switched for you, when you stopped watching films as entertainment and you thought, I want to become a film buff? And so what are the movies that I should watch in order to learn more about cinema as a whole?
I guess probably because of the way I'd started watching films, that like genre was always a big thing to me growing up, and it was always something, and I guess it was because the way things started, it always felt slightly illicit. I was always like trying to watch films that were like a higher rating than I was allowed to go. To stress that differently from the US, where in the US, if you have a parent or guardian, they could take you to an R-rated film if they were hugely irresponsible. But in the UK, if it was like a 15 or an 18, or back then a AA and an X, you couldn't go. Even something like Gremlins, which is a quite ferocious kids film in a way, but in the UK it was a 15 certificate and I was 10, and so me and my brother like tried everything to get into that movie and succeeded by going up to the cinema manager with a copy of the novelization and said, I'm 10 and my brother's 12, but we've read the novelization of Gremlins and so we won't be scared and we'd like to see the movie because we know what the ending is. And the manager said, looked around at the empty lobby, goes, get in there. Like, and so he let us in, and it was probably the most exciting performance of a film I've ever seen because A, the film was great, especially as a 10-year-old, and B, just the sheer terror of maybe being thrown out at any moment because I wasn't supposed to be there. And then later that sort of like obsession with genre continued. Like, I always like think that directors like John Carpenter and John Landis were people that I started to be able to see what, if there is an auteur theory, but what signified a John Landis film, what signified a John Carpenter film, or what signified a Joe Dante film. And then when I was a teenager, I knew I wanted to do something in film, but it hadn't really kind of crystallized exactly what that was. And so various things that both me and my brother were interested in doing was like, do we want to do makeup? Do we want to make monsters? Do we want to be animators? Do we want to write? Do we want to do comic books? And it was actually this TV series that Jonathan Ross did called The Incredibly Strange Film Show, which showed in 1988 and 1989. And this was on network TV. Like back then, there were only 4 channels in the UK. So on Channel 4, on a weekday evening, Jonathan Ross would spend an hour talking about famous auteurs, whether it was John Waters or Russ Meyer or George Romero or Doris Wishman or like, you know, a number of like interesting, like mostly independent filmmakers. And one of the episodes was about Sam Raimi. And I saw this when I was 14. And it hadn't occurred to me until watching that documentary that there was an entry level as somebody. I just assumed at that point wrongly, because I hadn't read many film books, that film directors were just dropped off like by a stalk at Universal Studios, that's how Steven Spielberg came to be, is that he's like, you know, you don't think that I didn't really think of where directors came from. When I saw that documentary and it's talking about Sam Raimi being a teenager and raising money to make like his first new feature shot on 16mm, it was such a vivid light bulb moment of like, okay, that's what I'm gonna do. And I went to art college when I was 18, and there was a sort of period where being in art college and sort of having access to their library, which had a number of films which you could watch in viewing booths, is where I maybe started to sort of expand the films that I was seeing especially in terms of seeing international cinema. And usually I found that like genre was always like a gateway into those films a lot of times. And that was just always interesting to me. It's usually like sort of a gateway into like an international film with through a horror film or through another genre film. So it's like kind of that thing of connections of like, okay, maybe I knew who Dario Argento was and had seen his films, and it's like, oh, Once Upon a Time in the West is written by Dario Argento and Bernardo Bertolucci. Okay, let's watch some Bertolucci films. If any like prolific director has made anything vaguely genre-ish, that's the first one I would have seen of their filmography. And then you start to expand. But I think that's an okay way to get into it.
Yeah, and that's what I got to say. What I love about your work and as you as a person is that you have such a wide range of influences and you're so enthusiastic about film in general. You're not snobbish about what's high art and what's low art. And through your films, you introduce people to films that they've never seen. Like I have to imagine after you talk so much about Walter Hill's The Driver, during the press for Baby Driver, that so many people would have seen that film that would have never sought it out otherwise.
I mean, I'm always happy to do that because I always want to be kind of like, just lay bare my influences. I don't like it sometimes when directors pretend like they haven't seen things, not mentioning any names, but like, you know, that happens a lot sometimes when a film is clearly influenced by somebody and the director say, oh no, I never saw that movie. It's like, liar. Sometimes you might have seen the film that's influenced, but you haven't seen the source. I'm always interested in going back and back and back because sometimes my ways into a filmmaker are very like roundabout. But I think about the sort of the people that made me interested in film, like just having that book by Danny Peary, Cult Movies, was just kind of like a, you know, such a sort of a gateway into not only the movies in the book, but everything else. Like, because you might have this one film by a director, but then once you see that one and you like it, then you want to see all the films by that director.
You also guest edited an edition of Empire magazine, where you spoke a lot about the memories of watching films inside a theatre. And you got a lot of your famous friends to talk about that as well. So what do you think it is about the cinematic experience that makes those memories so potent?
Why I did that Empire article was I wanted to focus on audience reactions to moments and what moments in films you remembered because of the audience response. I was getting pretty tired of reading these doom-laden pieces of people kind of proclaiming the death of cinema. And a lot of it was concentrating on the movies and how much they made and what big hits they were. And I felt like, well, what I remember with some of these movies is like the response of the audience, whether it's a full house or whether it's just 6 other people. So that is something that I just wanted to do a piece about that. Because when you watch a movie at home and you've seen it at the cinema, you'll never forget the response of the audience to something, maybe an emotional thing, maybe like a shock moment, maybe like just like people laughing so hard you can't hear the dialogue, maybe like a random round of applause. And I started to feel a bit sad for some of the, I guess like in the end of last year, I felt sorry for those filmmakers who had been robbed of the audience response. And I found myself sometimes watching films and then remembering like sort of a particular kind of reaction in the middle of a scene. And that just made me want to kind of like ask a lot of people. It was fans and also other filmmakers that I'd actually never spoken to before. So it was actually a great excuse to get on the phone with Ang Lee and Spike Lee and James Cameron. And it was pretty amazing.
Is there a particular moment that stands out for you from watching a film in theatres?
It was funny watching big audience crowd pleasers again at home. And I was watching some films with my girlfriend that she had never seen. And it was quite amazing, like, sort of, she seems to have got through life without knowing the ending of The Sixth Sense. And as soon as you realize, I'm thinking, hey, let's watch this film and just see if it still works. And it's amazing when it does. And then they're looking at you like you've tricked them. And in Fatal Attraction, there was a moment in that movie that I remember when I saw it in the cinema. It's when Anne Archer starts to sort of push back and sort of picks up the phone, talks to Glenn Close, and says, if you come near my family again, I'll kill you. And it's all shot in a mid-shot. And I just remember watching that at the cinema and the audience like applauded. And it was like you know, and it's like, it's odd in that particular movie because that movie is, you know, sort of is, you know, kind of problematic for some, but it is also that thing where it's like, it's, you know, the manipulation of the audience is quite extraordinary, where you can feel the sort of like the audience starting to kind of like rise up and get fired up.
What do you get out of watching a horror film? Is it a safe place to explore terrifying feelings?
When I'm watching a horror film, and I've obviously seen many, I always get a kick out of when I'm surprised or shocked by something. I think the last film that I saw at the cinema with an audience was Julia Ducournau's Raw, where the experience of watching the film and watching the backs of people's heads is kind of just intertwined forever. Because I saw that at the New Art in Los Angeles, and all I remember is there seemed to be a lot of people on dates, which is maybe either the best or the worst date film, I can't tell. Maybe the best. All I can remember is in the infamous waxing scene, that I remember seeing people like start to slink down in their seat. And so because that cinema is like all on the level, all I can think about in that scene is watching people's heads start to squirm down in their seat. And that's just a very profound image to me. If a horror film is not transgressive in any way or isn't going to some kind of uncomfortable territory, then it's probably not doing its job. So it's always a thrilling thing to me when something like that just works. That's what I like sort of watching older films with an audience as well, is where you find films that still have the power to shock, like even younger, more jaded audiences now.
And when you were writing Last Night in Soho, were you thinking about those moments, the moments that you want to make people slink down in their seats?
Yeah, I mean, I think in Last Night in Soho, it's a film where sort of the point of the movie is that it's a cautionary tale about nostalgia, about the dangers of overly romanticizing the past, because people tend to, if they think back to like a previous era, they're usually concentrating on the good things. And so in my movie, it's like, the 60s, yeah. Swinging 60s, the epicenter of cool in London, and film and music and fashion. And of course, all of that happened. But everything bad that's happening now was also happening then. So I try to sort of like create something which kind of gets increasingly intense as it goes along. And I think that's, for me, like some of my favorite films in that genre, where there's a sort of a headlong rush into the void.
Sounds like the perfect film to see in a theatre.